Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. This is kind of an interesting format. We haven't done this before. Nathan Smith is joining us again. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me again.
And the reason I had Nathan on is, first of all, a lot of people were really touched by the episode that I did with him. Got a lot of tremendous feedback from people. Just how, like, his story about suffering PTSD as a result of his experience on the mission field. His then later starting to get involved in pursuing a degree in psychology, and so those are things that happened to him, and it also his faith journey and how that affected him as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on in somebody's head when all that stuff is going on, obviously, to say the least. But we thought, let's just broaden it out and have an interesting conversation, because this world we live in, it's kind of a crazy world we're living in, and there's just a lot happening. And one thing that him and I have both discussed is that there is a serious mental health crisis happening in evangelicalism as well as in Mormonism. And we thought that this would be a good convergence where we could have this conversation. So, Nathan, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And
Excited to be here.
and I've already thank you for coming on already. But my thing is what are your thoughts? Like, you and I were just discussing a little off camera a little bit ago about maybe using January 6th as a starting off point, because when I was watching the video or watching it live, and I saw all these crosses and I saw all these Christian flags as they were rushing up the Capitol steps, I was very, very upset, because I realized that those were my people that were doing that. And only for the grace of God, maybe I would have been one of those people if I had taken a different path in my life. Um, and it just dawned on me then. I was angry at them, but then a few days, as the time came where I started kind of meditating on what happened, I realized, you know what, evangelicalism has a mental health crisis. And uh, and of course, then we saw Captain Moroni roaming the Capitol, the rotunda, and you see the man. The man, I think, has been arrested, but you could tell this is somebody who needs some help. And so we had the Christian flag, we had the cross, and we had Captain Moroni storming on January 6th. What do you think about all that nonsense that happened?
Well, I'm of course one person with a very limited perspective, but I think something that really impressed me, or left an impression on me, I should say, about January 6th is that I think I often think of religion as this thing that's sort of just relegated to private life, especially in the West, that it's something you do on a Sunday, or it's something that kind of breaks into your day-to-day life in very minute ways, like maybe you don't go drinking with your buddies after work or something like that. But I think that January 6th was a really interesting illustration of how there are real world consequences for religion done poorly. I think we could say, or at the very least, religion exploited by, like what you were describing before, exploited by mental health problems that may be pre-existing, or things that just aren't necessarily purely cognitive, if that makes sense. Something that's not like a purely intellectual failing, but like that there might be something more to be said than just these people were duped.
Yes, and this is the other thing I just want to also bring out to the audience is that um, I'm not here to get political. So if you voted for Trump, or you voted for Biden, in one sense, I don't care. This isn't really about that, because, to be honest with you, there's a lot of things that I see on the left, the secular religion, if you will, that also is in deep need of some mental health as well. But so, and again, I'm not trying to take sides here. I'm not trying to say that one side or another, but because this relates to our religious traditions, and it directly affects people that maybe we even know, family, friends, and associates that might be caught up in a lot of things, conspiracy stuff, QAnon, and all these things. And just to see what it's been doing to people's lives, it's truly a tragedy. And so I just want to just let people know that America has a mental health crisis. Let's just put it this way. It isn't just evangelicalism, and it isn't just Mormonism. So yeah, Nathan, I just got so distraught over what I saw. But then, like I said earlier, I felt like, okay, there's something going on here. Part of me thinks is it, do you think that maybe religious people, or maybe people on the right, from more conservative aspects of Christianity don't have the tools in their kit, perhaps, to deal with maybe issues? Is that maybe they don't have all the tools in their kit, and maybe it's because of what they were taught or some misinformation they were taught, or what do you think that's all, what the issue is there?
I think that's a really good question. I think there is definitely, I know I said earlier that it's not purely cognitive, but I think we shouldn't discount the cognitive side of this too. For instance, in Mormonism, there's a long history ranging from J. Reuben Clark to Ezra Taft Benson of at times pretty extremely right-leaning ideology. So there is kind of a not only an intellectual precedent within Mormon thought, but also an authorized perspective in a manner of speaking, because you have Ezra Taft Benson, for instance, as president of the church, who was very outspoken anti-communist. He was very, very much outspoken against what he perceived to be the threats of like large-scale, well-involved government, social services, and the like. And the way that he got his information was through organizations such as the John Birch Society and the like, that have been accused of all sorts of interesting things. But I think that heritage definitely affects how a lot of Latter-day Saints today think about it. I think in addition to that as well, I think one of the interesting things about Ezra Taft Benson was his fascination with the Book of Mormon. And in Mormonism, he was one of the figureheads that was responsible for, in a manner of speaking, repopularizing the Book of Mormon in Mormon culture, centering Mormon identity on the Book of Mormon, reading the Book of Mormon, studying the Book of Mormon, testifying of the Book of Mormon, and so on. And I think on the surface, it was to promote the Christ-centered nature of the Book of Mormon, which textually is absolutely accurate. But I think that something that fascinated the book Ezra Taft Benson about the Book of Mormon was its focus on secret combinations, and the sense that there is a fragile foundation to society that can be disrupted by forces that you cannot see, but which are fully active within your political sphere, within your social sphere, which operate on secret signs and signals to one another, and which are actively seeking to break down what you consider to be stability and even value. So I think that the Latter-day Saints, at least on the Mormon perspective here, I think the Latter-day Saints definitely have a lot of material that they could very easily draw upon to intellectually rationalize modern day conspiracy theories, like those which we've seen through, unfortunately, like the QAnon material that's seeped into Mormon culture, the material that essentially in large part motivated people to storm the Capitol on January 6th.
And just a reminder that I did do a 3-part interview with Matt Harris, and we discussed the Ezra Taft Benson story. Matt's done some tremendous work in that area, and of course, this is not here to bash the prophet or anything like that. It's just an observation that sometimes, even if something is done, like study the Book of Mormon, it's a good thing. Sometimes people can take things too far too, and so, and again, it's not that conspiracy theories are necessarily entirely false. In some sense, they're true in the sense that, yes, there are very powerful people in high positions that sometimes aren't looking out for people, and they do intend to do harm to people. So in one sense, conspiracy theories can offer a roadmap to try to figure out the way things go in this world. But the problem is that once you make that your entire worldview and live in that world, that's where it gets destructive. But there are corporations that do terrible things, and they influence governments, and they hurt people, and they hurt countries. And so those are valid concerns. So I'm not trying to even say that there aren't legitimate, issues that people can have, and that a conspiracy theory mindset can maybe help you sort things out. The problem is that once it gets infected or too deeply ingrained in you and affects you really how you see your world on a day-to-day basis, where it gets really dangerous. And that's the thing, Nathan, is, there often is a kernel of truth to conspiracy theories. And that's what causes people to go down the rabbit hole, if you will, sometimes. And then that's where often people will go down this rabbit hole, and then maybe they will start having some mental health issues, or people with mental health issues might go down, are more apt to go down that rabbit hole.
I think it's interesting too, because I hear that, and I think from a psychiatric perspective or a psychotherapeutic perspective, one thing that we often talk about is how, from the perspective of natural selection, emotions like, or affective states, I should say, like depression or anxiety, actually have some sort of adaptive function. So you get things like hair color, for instance, that'll vary across the planet. There's nothing really adaptive about hair color. It's not a negative adaptation. It's not a positive adaptation. But things like anxiety and depression are universal throughout human beings, to the point that it really starts to make one wonder whether or not anxiety and depression actually have some sort of adaptable function to them. I think if you think about anxiety, for instance, it's essentially threat detection. It's trying to think of all the ways in which your future could go awry. And there's a level at which that that kind of stress, if kept at like a moderate, manageable level, can actually be helpful for avoiding issues down the line. We distinguish this between with terms like distress versus eustress. Eustress is actually quite positive. It helps you write your paper on time. It helps you get to work in the morning. It helps you meet your deadlines, and so on and so on. But distress, of course, is something that might land you in a clinic. So I think, to bring that back to what you were saying, I think there is, I think there's utility in understanding that authority figures are absolutely capable of great harm, especially being in positions of authority that come with a lot of power and influence. I think of concerns I have about lobbying, for instance. I think that everyone, just about everyone, kind of has a scenario in their mind of how a powerful corporation or a government entity of some kind might be dangerous to the people. I think it's why we go out and vote. I think it's why we remain politically informed on some level. But I think that just as there's a difference between eustress and distress, I think that for me, what I see is, when I use the term conspiracy theory, for instance, I usually reserve that for something that is, on an evidence-based level, unfounded, but based in an affective kind of paranoia, if you know what I mean. Like, so this is kind of what I mean when I say that January 6th, I don't think should be reduced to a purely cognitive level. I think this is actually one of the risks of limiting our conversation purely to misinformation, which is important as well. The dissemination of misinformation on social media, I think, is a very critical issue. But I think, in addition to that, I think that we need to study the motivations that lead people to gravitate toward these conspiracy theories, these elaborate, especially like these very Baroque ones that QAnon has, for instance, of very detailed plans for some sort of, staged problem or staged crisis or anything like that. I think it's important to understand the underlying emotional things that can lead someone to glom onto these sort of ideological frameworks.
About a year and a half ago, right as this whole COVID situation was just getting started, I actually kind of had almost kind of an epiphany experience when I was talking to a group of evangelical Christians. And at the time, I kind of was spiritually not really there. Like, I was kind of just detached, if you will, from my spirituality. And I was hearing these people talk, and I was so shocked, because honestly, if you had told me, okay, you have the Mandela effect, you have the flat earther, or you have the QAnon, which one do you think will go mainstream? I think I would have had QAnon as the last possible one. It just amazed me. I couldn't believe that this actually made it into the mainstream of evangelicalism. And these people were talking, and they had all this fear. Everything was so fearful. And that's when I realized that I wasn't afraid. And, that's where I kind of had a spiritual epiphany where, we're supposed to have a peace that surpasses all understanding. And while all these other people were very fearful of what was going on, I was at total peace. And it's supposed to be the other way around. The Christians are supposed to have that peace, but I didn't see it. I saw nothing but fear. And it really shook me, because I recognized what I saw was that, I kind of left evangelicalism for 20 years. And I said, I've made this analogy before, but I roamed the wilderness, if you will, for 20 years. And when I came back, the village was on fire. And I felt so grieved for what was happening to my people, if you will. And I realized that, I think it's partly to do with maybe what was taught from the pulpits. Now, I'm going to be more critical of evangelicalism, and I don't even necessarily think that a whole lot was taught at the pulpits from the general authorities or the brethren, so much as just. But on our side, we certainly did have a lot of that, and they were just, everything was fear based. Like everything was like, you gotta get to church, or you gotta become a Christian, otherwise you're going to go to hell. So there was a fear motivator, afraid of hell. And then the other fearful thing was, well, you got to get saved because we're living in the last days. And so it was a fear of the end times, the apocalypse, or hell, or a combination of both. And I realized that a lot of people who were in the church came into the church because out of fear, and they never were taught about the gifts of the fruits of the Spirit, and about peace, and having that peace in Christ, and all that, and it wasn't there. And that's when I realized, like, there's something that went terribly wrong with my faith, in my faith movement. And like I said, I almost decided when January 6th happened, I was actually not going to do the Mormon book reviews. I was actually going to do a different channel that was going to address some issues that I found in evangelicalism. But I found that this conversation is worth having because, there was also a lot of people, from the LDS side that, of course, we know of some of the incidences that happened with, like, Julie Rowe and the Daybells, and kind of this prepper conspiracy end of the world group. This mindset predates January 6th, and of course it predates my people were doing stuff in the 60s and 70s preparing for the end of the world. So we can maybe just talk about how it wasn't necessarily, like I said, I don't think that there was really anything taught from the pulpits in the LDS church, by the brethren, but a lot of the lay people glommed onto certain verses, certain phrases, and kind of came up with this entire elaborate conspiracy that predates QAnon. And I kind of, if anything, it kind of is a forerunner to it in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's brilliantly put. I'm especially intrigued by your experience, like you said, when you returned from the wilderness, so to speak, to find the village on fire. The fact that these people were discussing these elaborate conspiracy theories out of a motivation of fear that seemed very foreign to you from your own Christian experience of being able to find that peace that surpasseth all understanding, and so on. I think that it's a really good illustration of the fact that the affective dimension of what we're talking about here is actually not secondary, and it's not necessarily even equal to the cognitive side. It actually precedes it in a lot of ways. I think I have an experience myself that I think would illustrate this a little bit. When I was a missionary, I was as we learned in my last interview, I had a very difficult mission. And so I was very commonly in distress. And I remember one night when I was sleeping in my apartment, I had this apartment where the door to the bedroom was open, and it was right at the feet of my bed. And if you go straight out that door and then take a left, you'll be right at the front door of the apartment. It wasn't a very big thing. And I remember just feeling this palpable discomfort, this kind of mounting panic. And I wasn't 100% sure what it was, but it kept building and building and looping and becoming more and more intense. And the more and more intense it became, the more and more intense my mind started to work. I started to formulate this really elaborate fantasy about this killer who was going to come and kill me and my companion in the night. And granted, I was like half awake, so my mind is, on a rational level, my mind isn't really operating in that level. But I began with this panic, and then I started lacquering on these rationalizations on top of it. I had an affective experience, a feeling, an emotion, and then I started creating a narrative after that to explain why I was feeling that way. I didn't have being half awake, I didn't have that kind of metacognitive capacity to question my emotion, to say, okay, maybe I'm just feeling this at random. Maybe it's a dietary thing. Maybe I'm too tired. Maybe I'm too stressed. So I created this narrative. And I think that it's something that we see very much in what we're discussing here. When you returned to your community and you found people drawing on QAnon, I think it's a question of what drew them there. What was the panic, so to speak, that drew them there? And I think that for my own community within Mormonism, and specifically within the LDS Church, I think the narratives that Latter-day Saints would very naturally draw upon are those that were quite popular with authority figures like Ezra Taft Benson, but also in our literature, about secret combinations, even down to Cain and Abel, of Cain becoming Master Mahon, who creates this sort of secret pact with Satan in order to get gain and in order to kill his own brother. So I think it's important to understand that while we're drawing on these narratives that are available to us as in our own distinct cultures, I think it's important to understand that if we leave the conversation at the level of purely the narratives or the ways in which we rationalize our prior emotions, we end up losing track of what started these rationalizations in the first place.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, sometimes I wonder too, is that, I know in evangelicalism, there's always been a very strong aversion to getting mental health, getting help for mental health. Some people even considered going pharmacology was a type of magic, or something, has its roots in this particular word, and that they thought it was almost of the devil to take medication. There was a real taboo. What kind of response, like what was the view of getting psychiatric help in the LDS culture? How do people view it there?
I think that's a really good question. I think that Latter-day Saints are certainly not immune to this sort of perspective, where I think it's sort of born in this sense that the gospel is supposed to make you happy. So you're supposed to be at peace. You're supposed to be happy. So if you're experiencing something like anxiety or depression, then I think there is a tendency to say, well, you just need more gospel. And usually that takes the form of pray better or pray more, read scriptures better or read them more, meet with your bishop a little more frequently, or make sure you're going to church. Do the things that make you happy, or make you feel peace. But I think there is also a bit of a pragmatic side to Mormonism. I mean, it's a community of people who have had to work very concretely to create their communities, whether in Kirtland or Nauvoo or in the Salt Lake Basin. So I think there's a very mixed bag of feelings, I would say, about psychiatric intervention. But I think that while I don't know if we would demonize medication specifically, I think there is a tendency to, or at least I think there would be a set of questions that the average Latter-day Saint would have to ask themselves about having to visit a therapist or a psychiatric consultant of some kind to address a problem that church can't fix.
Growing up, I mean, there was people that were really into word of faith. I didn't ever believe that, but I knew a lot of people that did, who believed basically if you just had enough faith, you'll overcome illness and sickness and depression and anxiety. And it's almost then becomes a sense of blaming the victim. If you aren't getting better, then it's on you. It's your lack of faith that's causing this to happen. And is there any kind of thought of that within your movement?
I think so, yes. I think there's a common mindset that every human being slips into every now and again, called a just world hypothesis, where we look at the world as it is and we assume that things are as they are because they should be that way. So I think a really good example actually would be, say, like the book of Job. When Job is in the full throe of his afflictions, his friends come to him, they sit with him in silence for 7 days or so, but then the silence breaks and they start having to rationalize it. Why is Job suffering? And there's always an explanation, according to his friends at least. There's always a reason why he's suffering that makes sense, why he should be suffering, even if Job maybe is innocent on some level, like maybe you accidentally sinned. So just go quickly repent, and God will fix everything. So there's a strong element of that in the Book of Mormon, where the Nephite covenant is essentially, in as much as the Nephites follow the commandments of the Lord, they prosper in the land. If they fall away from the covenants, and the commandments, they fall apart as a society. And I think that is very easily translated into a kind of Latter-day Saint culture, or at least subculture, that views struggle and suffering as a sign that you are insufficiently following the gospel, you are insufficiently meeting the terms of your covenants. I think it's an absolutely ready-made narrative that people draw on quite often when they feel an amount of shame or guilt, is that there are these ways of easily rationalizing that into saying that it is your fault, which I think on some level helps people feel almost powerful. Because, for instance, when you think of depression, one of the elements of depression is powerlessness. You have this sense of hopelessness, powerlessness, and worthlessness. And so if you can create a narrative in your mind that says essentially you're feeling this way because you're doing something wrong, then that means that it is within your capacity, within your power, within your agency to fix that situation, which may be a way of at least trying in an after the fact ad hoc kind of way to deal with that sense of powerlessness.
One of the things that I noticed too growing up was that a lot of people believed that mental illness often was a demonic thing, and that the people were afflicted by evil spirits, and that they need to have demons cast out of them. And of course, it's just such a terrible mindset to have, because just imagine being depressed or having a mental illness and then have to carry the burden of your family and friends thinking you're possessed, or you have, is there a parallel to that in your movement?
I don't know if there's anything particularly like explicit in Mormonism that would suggest, because we're actually we don't have a very well-versed like demonology. That's something that Mormons, I think, lack very much. In fact, I think if you were to ask a Mormon like too many detailed questions about the devil, they would probably pull out that famous C.S. Lewis quote, "We don't talk about the devil because it draws the devil in," something like that. But that's not to say that we don't struggle with connecting things like mental illness with even like moral evil. Again, it's that consequentialist viewpoint, where if you're having an experience, it's the consequences of your actions. So if you're feeling good, it's because you're doing good, you're doing righteous things. If you're feeling bad, it's because you're doing bad. It's the Lord trying to tell you you're not on the right path. And I mean, that's deeply ancient, like very human mindsets. We think very much in terms of cause and effect. We think very much in terms of human agency. And it's a long precedent in history. You can go back to ancient Mesopotamia, to Sumerian medical texts that talk a lot about the conditions that today we would describe as things like depression or anxiety and the like, various mental states and emotional states that it was not uncommon to connect them to some sort of evil spirit or demon or the like. But no, I wouldn't say Mormonism has anything explicit in it, but I do think there is an underlying sense of taking on a sense of guilt for suffering.
Mm-hmm. I think this is part one of our discussion, and so I just want to kind of just maybe prepare the way for let's talk about maybe potential solutions. Let's kind of talk a little bit about maybe potential solutions that we can use and tools that we could have, because like I said earlier in the conversation, I almost feel like a lot of people of faith just don't have the tools that they need to navigate themselves in this world. I think a lot of people are seeing, especially Americans. Okay, let's just be frank here. This is basically white middle class America is having a identity crisis because things aren't going the way they thought they were supposed to go. I mean, in my movement, we should be in the second or third decade of the millennium. When I was talking in the 80s and 90s about the year 2020 and 2030, they'd all be like, well, that's crazy. The Lord's going to come by then. Well, he hasn't come. And I sometimes wonder, is it the second coming that didn't occur when many evangelicals thought it would? You got to understand, in the 1970s, the most sold book in the 1970s period was The Late Great Planet Earth by Hale Lindsey. And essentially he set the calendar up that basically by 1988, everything would be wound up, because it would be 40 years after the establishment, a biblical generation of the nation of Israel. So that was the buildup for decades. And a lot of people, once Israel became a nation, that was what they called back in the day the super sign. They even said that was Israel becoming a nation is what proved the Bible to be true. That's how bold of an assertion it made. So that was so fundamental to everybody. And then it's the year 2021, and nothing has happened. And Jesus hasn't returned. And a lot of people have this idea that there's going to be this rapture before things get really bad. And in one sense, things have gotten kind of really bad, and they're still here. And so they weren't prepared for that. I think they were caught flat-footed because they just thought, well, that just doesn't happen to us. That happens to people in the third world. What started happening to our country, the last 20 some plus years have been apocalyptic in one sense, but the Messiah has not come back. And so I think that also is something that Christians are kind of having to deal with as well, is that they haven't flown away because they have to deal with the reality of this world, and maybe they're going to be here for a while.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because I think that living in 2021, the world doesn't look anything like anyone thought it would in 1999, for instance. We're a post 9/11 world. We're a post, Afghanistan, Iran, and the like. We're also a world that's very steeped in things like social media. I know that that's kind of like maybe a lowbrow talking point, but I think there's something really to be said about the fact that the level of communication that we have with one another, the level of interaction, and the level of media exposure, the level of scrutiny that we can have of perfect strangers across the world is kind of unprecedented. It's a world that, in a large part, we really didn't foresee in a lot of ways. And I think that there are two sort of general ways in which people have attempted to respond to that, attempted to respond to essentially living in a world that they never saw coming. And one, I think, is the mindset that we've been discussing so far, which is to perceive this unknown world, this unforeseen world, as a kind of catastrophe, that we were doing so well and then everything fell to pieces. And that might be because it's a sign of the times. It might be because your country is failing you and now you need to take it back. It might be any kind of rationalized narrative, but I think it begins with this sense of shifting from a world where you felt powerful in the sense of like having self-efficacy. You felt like things were sensible and made sense to you. You felt like you belonged and had an identity and had a purpose, into a world where suddenly a lot of the foundations that you relied upon are no longer these monoliths. They're just sort of one valid option among many others.
Yeah, excellent point. And yeah, the narrative, there's been Christian privilege in this country since the very beginning, and the Christians are starting to lose that privilege, and it's fearful to them. And we are living in a postmodern world, and a lot of people just they're not prepared for it. They just don't have the tools. And I think that as somebody who's kind of coming back into the movement, I'm hoping that we can have conversations like these where we don't try to hold on to everything that we think is so important, to maybe let go of some things and then reevaluate what is important in our lives, and then take what we have gotten in our background, what we've been taught, the good things that we've been taught and the values that we've been taught, and then to be able to integrate them in a way that can be useful to navigate ourselves in this new world that we live in. So I just want to conclude here with part one of our special of Mormonism and mental health. And I want to thank you, Nathan, for coming on. I think on our next episode is we're going to kind of maybe try to be a little bit more solutions based, maybe steps that people can take, and then we will do that. And I really hope this is going to be a productive conversation. You know, the reason why I'm doing this series is because I'm actually going to be heading out of town for a couple different trips to two different Zions, if you will. And as a result, we wanted to have these episodes pre-taped. I don't have time to read a book, so author interviews are kind of like off the table right now. And I just thought, well, let's just do a special, a two-parter where we talk about these things. So I think it's kind of important that we have these valuable conversations. Nathan, thank you so much for coming onto the program.
Thank you for having me again, Steve.
So like and subscribe, and we will see you next time for part two. Have a great day.